Imagine stepping off a plane in Cusco, Peru. Within hours, your skull feels like it's splitting, your chest tightens, and every breath feels like it's slipping away before it even reaches your lungs. Welcome to 11,200 feet above sea level, a place where half of all visitors collapse within their very first day. Modern doctors call it acute mountain sickness. The locals, they just call it life. Now here's the mind-bending part. 5 centuries ago, an entire empire didn't just survive up here, they thrived. They carved cities into the clouds, hauled stones heavier than modern cranes can lift, and built a civilization so advanced that Spanish conquistadors believed they had stumbled upon gods. Before we unravel this astonishing story, take a second to hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? Down at sea level, or are you one of the rare few who actually live among the mountains? Because what you're about to discover will rewrite everything you thought you knew about human limits. The Incas weren't just survivors of high altitude, they were genetic pioneers unlocking biological secrets written into their very blood. Secrets so powerful that science today is only beginning to decode them. This isn't just history. This is the story of how the thin air of the Andes forged warriors who didn't just conquer empires, they conquered human evolution itself. At 11,200 feet above sea level, Cusco exists in what scientists call the death zone's little brother. The air contains roughly 35% less oxygen than at sea level. Your body, designed for thicker air, begins to rebel almost immediately. First comes the headache. Not the gentle throb you might dismiss with an aspirin, but a relentless pounding that feels like your skull is in a vice. Your heart, desperate to pump enough oxygen to your organs, begins racing like an engine pushed beyond its limits. Each breath feels shallow, unsatisfying, as if you're trying to drink water through a straw. Modern climbers know this enemy well. Acute mountain sickness affects roughly 75% of people who ascend rapidly to altitudes above 8,000 feet. The symptoms read like a medieval curse: nausea so severe you can't keep food down, dizziness that makes walking a dangerous gamble, and a fatigue so profound that lifting your arm feels like moving mountains. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. Push higher, and acute mountain sickness evolves into something far more sinister. High-altitude cerebral edema causes your brain to swell inside your skull. Victims lose coordination, become confused, and if not evacuated immediately, slip into comas. High-altitude pulmonary edema fills your lungs with fluid, essentially drowning you in the middle of a mountain. Even today, with all our medical knowledge and emergency evacuation procedures, altitude kills. Experienced mountaineers equipped with the latest gear and backed by decades of research still fall victim to the mountain's thin air. The death rates speak for themselves. On Everest, statistically, 1 person dies for every 10 who reach the summit. Now imagine facing these challenges 5 centuries ago. No oxygen tanks, no helicopters for emergency evacuation, no understanding of the physiological mechanisms at play, just human will against the merciless physics of atmospheric pressure. The Spanish conquistadors, these hardened warriors who had conquered empires across 2 continents, arrived in the Andes and immediately understood they had encountered something beyond their experience. Francisco Pizarro's men, veterans of countless battles, found themselves gasping like fish out of water. They called it soroche, borrowing the Quechua word, but they had no real understanding of what was happening to their bodies. Pedro de Chiesa de Leon, one of the most detailed chroniclers of the conquest, wrote about watching strong soldiers collapse from exhaustion after walking distances that would barely qualify as a morning stroll at sea level. Horses, these magnificent animals that had given the Spanish their military advantage across the Americas, struggled to carry even their own weight in the thin mountain air. But the indigenous people? They moved through these altitudes like dolphins through water. They carried massive loads up mountain paths that left Spanish soldiers breathless. They built cities at elevations where the conquistadors could barely function. They had somehow solved a puzzle that nature had been posing to humanity for millennia. But this wasn't magic. This was evolution in action, compressed into a time frame that defied everything scientists thought they knew about human adaptation. When we talk about the Inca Empire, we're not discussing a civilization that happened to live at high altitude. We're talking about a people who made the most hostile environments on Earth their homeland and then turned those environments into their greatest strategic advantage. Cusco, the capital of their empire, sits at 11,200 feet above sea level. But that was just their starting point. The Incas built cities and fortresses at altitudes that would challenge modern mountain climbers. Machu Picchu, the jewel of their architectural achievements, perches at 7,170 feet. The fortress of Sacsayhuaman, with its massive interlocking stones, stands at 11,500 feet. But these weren't even their highest settlements. Archaeological evidence reveals Inca settlements at altitudes exceeding 14,000 feet. Let me put that in perspective. That's higher than the tallest peaks in the continental United States. That's an altitude where modern climbers require weeks of acclimatization just to function for short periods, yet the Incas built permanent communities there. The engineering challenges alone should have been impossible. Moving the massive stone blocks that characterize Inca architecture requires not just human strength, but sustained human effort. At these altitudes, where every breath is a struggle, they somehow marshaled the labor force necessary to move stones weighing dozens of tons up mountainsides so steep that modern machinery would struggle. Consider the logistics of feeding a population at these elevations. Traditional agriculture becomes exponentially more difficult as altitude increases. The growing season shortens dramatically. Oxygen-starved soil produces lower yields. Yet the Incas not only fed their mountain populations, they created agricultural surpluses that supported one of the largest empires in the pre-Columbian Americas. Their road system, the Capacñan, stretched over 25,000 miles through terrain that would challenge modern highway engineers. These weren't simple dirt paths. These were sophisticated highways with drainage systems, bridges and way stations positioned at precise intervals. And they ran through elevations that spanned from sea level to over 16,000 feet, crossing passes that modern travelers navigate only with extreme caution. The Spanish chronicler Pedro Sancho wrote with obvious amazement about the Inca capital. The city of Cusco, being the principal and the greatest, was so large and beautiful that it would be remarkable even in Spain. But what truly shocked him wasn't the beauty of the city. It was watching its inhabitants go about their daily lives at an altitude where his own men could barely walk without gasping. When the Spanish arrived in 1532, they found not a struggling population barely surviving at the edge of human habitability, but a sophisticated civilization that had turned high altitude living into an art form. The Incas had developed specialized crops that thrived in thin air. They had created agricultural terraces that maximized growing potential at extreme elevations. They had established trade networks that spanned vertical miles of elevation change. Most remarkably, they had done all of this while maintaining a population that scholars estimate between 6 and 12 million people across their empire. This wasn't a small tribe eking out survival in the mountains. This was a demographic powerhouse that had figured out how to make the impossible possible. The conquistadors quickly realized that their military superiority meant nothing if they couldn't physically function in the Inca homeland. Horses, the technological advantage that had given them dominance across the Americas, became liabilities that required constant care and attention. Steel armor designed for European battlefields became crushing weight that made movement exhausting. Even their firearms, technological marvels of the 16th century, suffered from the effects of reduced air pressure on gunpowder combustion. But here's what truly mystified the Spanish. The Incas weren't just surviving at these altitudes, they were thriving, they were building, they were expanding. They had somehow unlocked secrets of human physiology that allowed them to live comfortably where others could barely survive. But this mastery over extreme altitude came at a cost that wouldn't be understood for centuries. In 1990, a team of physiologists arrived in the Peruvian Andes with a simple question: how do people live normally at altitudes that should kill them? What they discovered in the blood of high-altitude Andean populations would rewrite textbooks on human physiology and reveal one of the most remarkable examples of human evolution in action. The first clue came from a basic blood test. People of Andean descent living at high altitude have blood that looks fundamentally different from lowlanders. Their red blood cell count is dramatically elevated, sometimes 50% higher than sea level populations. But it's not just the quantity of red blood cells that's remarkable, it's their quality. Each red blood cell in a high-altitude Andean carries more hemoglobin, the protein that transports oxygen throughout the body. Their hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen, meaning it grabs onto oxygen molecules more efficiently in the thin air of high altitudes. But perhaps most remarkably, their hemoglobin releases oxygen to tissues more effectively once it reaches its destination. Dr. Cynthia Beale, a physical anthropologist who has spent decades studying high-altitude populations, discovered that Andean peoples have hearts that are structurally different from lowlanders. Their right ventricles, the chambers responsible for pumping blood to the lungs, are significantly enlarged. Their entire cardiovascular system has been redesigned by evolution to function optimally in low-oxygen environments. But the respiratory adaptations are perhaps even more impressive. High-altitude Andeans have lung capacities that exceed lowland populations by 20–30%. Their chest cavities are barrel-shaped, providing more room for expanded lung tissue. Most remarkably, their lungs contain more alveoli, the tiny air sacs where oxygen enters the bloodstream. They literally have more surface area for extracting oxygen from each breath. These aren't minor tweaks to human physiology. These are fundamental redesigns of the systems that keep us alive. And they represent evolutionary changes that occurred in a time frame that should have been impossible. Traditional evolutionary theory suggests that significant physiological adaptations require hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of years to develop and become fixed in a population. But the ancestors of the Incas arrived in the high Andes approximately 11,000 years ago. In evolutionary terms, that's the blink of an eye. Yet somehow, in this brief window, natural selection compressed what should have been hundreds of millennia of adaptation into just a few thousand years. The result was a population that had essentially become a different subspecies of human, one specifically designed for life in the thin air of extreme altitude. The comparison with other high-altitude populations makes this achievement even more remarkable. Tibetans, who have lived at high altitude for roughly 25,000 years, have developed their own unique adaptations, but their solutions to the altitude challenge are completely different from those of the Andeans. Tibetans don't significantly increase their red blood cell count. Instead, they've developed enhanced blood flow and improved oxygen delivery efficiency. Their adaptation strategy focuses on moving available oxygen more effectively rather than carrying more of it. It's an elegant solution, but it's entirely different from the Andean approach. The people of the Ethiopian highlands represent yet a third evolutionary strategy. Their adaptations focus primarily on more efficient oxygen utilization at the cellular level, with minimal changes to blood composition or cardiovascular structure. Three different populations, three completely different solutions to the same environmental challenge, but the Andean solution, the Inca solution, appears to be the most comprehensive and perhaps the most effective. Recent genetic studies have begun to identify the specific DNA changes responsible for these adaptations. Researchers have found mutations in genes that control red blood cell production, oxygen transport, and cardiovascular development. these genetic changes are found in over 90% of current high-altitude Andean populations, indicating that the evolutionary pressure for these adaptations was incredibly strong. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. These genetic adaptations aren't just historical curiosities, they're providing crucial insights for modern medicine. The same genetic mechanisms that allowed the Incas to thrive at high altitude are now being studied as potential treatments for heart disease, lung disorders, and other conditions related to oxygen delivery. Pharmaceutical companies are investing millions in research based on Andean genetics. The proteins produced by high-altitude adapted genes are being synthesized and tested as treatments for everything from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease to heart failure. The blood of the Inca descendants isn't just a testament to human adaptability, it's potentially the key to treating some of modern medicine's most challenging conditions. But the Incas had more than just genetic advantages. They had developed sophisticated understanding of their environment and their bodies that complemented their biological adaptations. The genetic adaptations were only part of the Inca success story. What truly set them apart was their sophisticated understanding of high-altitude medicine, developed over millennia and passed down through generations of mountain healers. At the center of their medical arsenal was a plant that the modern world knows primarily as the source of cocaine, coca leaves. But for the Incas, coca wasn't a recreational drug. It was essential medicine, as crucial to high-altitude survival as insulin is to a diabetic. Coca leaves contain more than just cocaine alkaloids. They're packed with vitamins, minerals, and compounds that directly counteract the physiological challenges of high altitude. The leaves contain significant amounts of vitamin C, preventing scurvy in populations with limited access to fresh fruits. They provide calcium, iron, and other minerals that support the increased metabolic demands of high-altitude living. But most importantly, coca leaves contain compounds that directly address altitude sickness. The alkaloids in coca leaves stimulate breathing, counteracting the natural tendency to hypoventilate at high altitude. They increase heart rate and blood pressure, improving oxygen delivery to tissues. They provide a mild analgesic effect that reduces the headaches associated with altitude sickness. The Incas had developed sophisticated methods of coca preparation that maximized these medical benefits. They understood that chewing the leaves with alkaline substances like lime or ash increased the bioavailability of the active compounds. They knew which varieties of coca were most effective for different conditions. They had established elaborate protocols for coca distribution that ensured adequate supplies for populations throughout their vertical empire. But coca was just one element in a comprehensive high-altitude pharmacopoeia. The Incas had identified dozens of high-altitude plants with specific medical properties. They used muña, a high-altitude mint, to treat digestive issues common at elevation. They employed cantuta, a flowering plant that grows at extreme altitudes, to treat respiratory problems. They had developed specific preparations from quinoa that provided concentrated nutrition for people struggling with altitude-induced appetite loss. Perhaps most remarkably, they had developed sophisticated breathing techniques that complemented their genetic adaptations. Inca medical practitioners understood that proper breathing at high altitude required specific patterns and techniques. They taught controlled breathing exercises that maximized oxygen uptake and minimized the energy cost of respiration. These breathing techniques weren't random folk practices. They were sophisticated physiological interventions that modern altitude medicine has only recently begun to understand and validate. The Inca breathing patterns included techniques that modern climbers know as pressure breathing, rest stepping, and high-altitude breathing rhythms. The Incas also understood the importance of gradual acclimatization, developing elaborate protocols for moving people between different altitude zones. Their road system included strategically placed way stations that allowed travelers to acclimatize gradually as they moved between elevations. They had developed specific dietary recommendations for people adjusting to new altitudes. They understood that certain activities should be avoided during the acclimatization process. Their medical knowledge extended to understanding the specific risks faced by different populations. They knew that pregnant women required special care at high altitude. They understood that children needed different acclimatization protocols than adults. They had developed specific treatments for the altitude-related complications that could affect the elderly. Most remarkably, they had developed surgical techniques adapted for high-altitude conditions. Archaeological evidence reveals that Inca healers performed successful skull surgeries at altitudes where modern medicine would consider such procedures extremely risky. They understood how to manage the increased bleeding risks associated with high altitude. They had developed anesthesia protocols that worked effectively in low-oxygen environments. The spiritual and psychological aspects of their high-altitude medicine were equally sophisticated. The Incas understood that altitude affects mental state and had developed specific rituals and practices to address the psychological challenges of mountain living. They had ceremonies specifically designed to ease the transition to high altitude. They had established support systems for people struggling with the isolation and environmental stress of mountain life. Their medical knowledge was preserved and transmitted through a complex system of healers and specialists. Different regions had experts who understood the specific challenges of their local altitude and climate. There were specialists who focused on treating altitude sickness, others who dealt with the unique dietary requirements of high-altitude populations, and still others who specialized in the psychological and spiritual aspects of mountain medicine. But all of this sophisticated medical knowledge was built on a foundation of genetic adaptations that represented millions of years of evolutionary refinement compressed into just a few millennia. In 2010, a team of geneticists published research that would fundamentally change our understanding of human evolution. They had been studying the DNA of high-altitude Andean populations, looking for the genetic basis of their remarkable adaptations. What they found challenged every assumption about the pace of evolutionary change. The human genome contains roughly 3 billion base pairs of DNA. Finding the specific changes responsible for high-altitude adaptation should have been like finding a handful of specific grains of sand on a beach, but the evolutionary pressure had been so intense and the adaptations so crucial for survival that the genetic signatures were unmistakable. The key discovery centered on a gene called EPAS1, also known as HIF2A. This gene controls the body's response to low oxygen conditions, regulating everything from red blood cell production to blood vessel development. In most human populations, EPAS1 exists in a standard form that works adequately at sea level but struggles in low oxygen environments. But in high-altitude Andean populations, researchers found a completely different version of EPAS1. This variant had mutations that dramatically enhanced its function in low oxygen conditions. The mutated gene triggered increased red blood cell production, promoted the development of enlarged hearts and lungs, and enhanced the efficiency of oxygen transport throughout the body. Here's what made this discovery truly groundbreaking. The mutations weren't random changes that happened to be beneficial. They were specific, targeted modifications that addressed exactly the challenges posed by high-altitude living. It was as if evolution had deliberately redesigned the gene for optimal high-altitude function. But the timeline made this discovery even more remarkable. Genetic analysis suggested that these mutations had appeared and become fixed in the population within just 3,000 generations. In evolutionary terms, that's impossibly fast. Traditional models suggested that beneficial mutations require tens of thousands of generations to spread through a population. Dr. Rasmus Nielsen, a leading evolutionary geneticist at the University of California, Berkeley, called it one of the fastest cases of human evolution ever documented. The selective pressure had been so intense that individuals without the beneficial mutations simply couldn't survive to reproductive age at high altitude. But EPAS1 wasn't the only gene that had undergone rapid evolution. Researchers identified at least a dozen other genes that showed clear signs of positive selection in high-altitude Andean populations. These genes controlled everything from iron metabolism to blood vessel development to cellular energy production. The BHLHE41 gene, which regulates circadian rhythms, had been modified to help high-altitude populations adapt to the intense UV radiation and extreme temperature variations of mountain environments. The THRB gene, involved in thyroid hormone regulation, had been altered to optimize metabolism for low oxygen conditions. The PIK3CD gene, crucial for immune system function, had been adapted to handle the increased infection risks associated with extreme environments. Each of these genetic changes represented thousands of years of evolutionary refinement, compressed into a time frame that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about the pace of genetic change. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery came when researchers began comparing the Andean adaptations to those of other high-altitude populations. Despite facing similar environmental challenges, Tibetans, Ethiopians, and Andeans had evolved completely different genetic solutions. Tibetans had developed mutations in the EPAS1 and EGLN1 genes that actually prevented the massive increase in red blood cell production seen in Andeans. Instead of carrying more oxygen, Tibetans had evolved more efficient oxygen utilization. Their genetic adaptations focused on improved blood flow and enhanced oxygen delivery to tissues. Ethiopians had evolved yet another strategy, with mutations in genes like BHLHE41 and VAV3 that enhanced oxygen utilization at the cellular level without significantly changing cardiovascular or respiratory systems. Three different populations, three completely different genetic strategies, all arriving at successful solutions to the same environmental challenge. It was a perfect example of convergent evolution, where similar environmental pressures lead to different but equally effective adaptations. But the Andean solution appeared to be the most comprehensive. While Tibetans and Ethiopians had focused on specific aspects of the altitude challenge, Andeans had developed a whole-body redesign that addressed every aspect of high-altitude living. The implications of these discoveries extend far beyond understanding Inca physiology. The genetic mechanisms identified in high-altitude populations are now being studied as potential treatments for a wide range of medical conditions. The enhanced oxygen transport systems of Andean populations offer insights for treating heart disease and stroke. Their improved red blood cell production could lead to treatments for anemia and other blood disorders. Their enhanced lung function provides models for addressing respiratory diseases. Pharmaceutical companies are now synthesizing proteins based on the high-altitude adapted genes, testing them as treatments for everything from chronic kidney disease to complications from premature birth. The genetic legacy of the Incas isn't just a fascinating example of human adaptability, it's potentially the foundation for the next generation of medical treatments. But these remarkable adaptations came with costs that are only now being understood. Evolution rarely provides perfect solutions. Every adaptation that enhances survival in one environment often creates vulnerabilities in others. The remarkable genetic changes that allowed the Incas to thrive at high altitude came with hidden costs that their descendants are still paying today. The most significant cost involves what happens when high-altitude adapted populations move to sea level. The same genetic modifications that provide advantages in thin air can become dangerous liabilities in oxygen-rich environments. Dr. Abigail Bigham, a genetic anthropologist at the University of Michigan, has spent years studying these adaptation trade-offs. Her research reveals that people with high-altitude genetic adaptations who move to sea level face increased risks of certain cardiovascular problems. Their hearts, enlarged and strengthened for pumping blood in low oxygen conditions, can develop dangerous rhythms when exposed to oxygen-rich environments. The enhanced red blood cell production that provides crucial advantages at altitude can lead to dangerous blood thickness at sea level. This condition, called polycythemia, increases the risk of blood clots, strokes, and heart attacks. The same blood that flows efficiently through high-altitude cardiovascular systems can become dangerously sluggish in the denser atmosphere of lower elevations. But the costs extend beyond cardiovascular issues. High-altitude genetic adaptations appear to increase susceptibility to certain types of infections. The immune system modifications that help cope with the stress of extreme altitude can leave populations vulnerable to diseases that rarely affect high-altitude communities. Women with high-altitude adaptations face specific challenges during pregnancy. While their genetic modifications help them carry pregnancies successfully at altitude, these same adaptations can complicate pregnancies at sea level. The enhanced cardiovascular systems that support fetal development in low-oxygen environments can lead to dangerous blood pressure changes in oxygen-rich conditions. Perhaps most concerning, recent research suggests that some high-altitude genetic adaptations may increase the risk of certain cancers. The genetic pathways that enhance cell survival in low-oxygen conditions are remarkably similar to the pathways that cancer cells use to survive in hostile environments. Several studies have identified elevated rates of specific cancers in populations with the strongest high-altitude adaptations. The modern descendants of the Incas face these challenges as globalization and economic opportunities pull them away from their ancestral highlands. Young people from high-altitude communities increasingly migrate to coastal cities for education and employment, carrying with them genetic adaptations that were perfected for environments they're leaving behind. Dr. Maria Rivera, a cardiologist working in Lima, Peru, sees the consequences daily in her practice. She treats patients from high-altitude communities who develop heart problems within months of moving to sea level. Their cardiovascular systems, optimized for the thin air of the Andes, struggle to adapt to the oxygen-rich environment of the coast. The situation is complicated by the fact that many of these health problems don't manifest immediately. The cardiovascular changes, the blood disorders, the immune system complications can take months or even years to develop. By the time symptoms appear, people have often established lives far from their highland homes, making it difficult to simply return to their ancestral elevations. But the challenges aren't limited to people who migrate to lower elevations. Climate change is bringing new stresses even to traditional high-altitude communities. Rising temperatures are altering the atmospheric conditions at high altitude, potentially disrupting the delicate balance between genetic adaptations and environmental conditions that took millennia to establish. The loss of traditional lifestyle patterns also creates problems. The sophisticated medical knowledge that complemented genetic adaptations is being lost as communities modernize. Young people no longer learn the breathing techniques, the medicinal plant preparation methods, or the acclimatization protocols that their ancestors developed over thousands of years. Modern medical care, while generally beneficial, often doesn't account for the unique physiology of high-altitude adapted populations. Standard medical treatments and drug dosages are calibrated for sea-level populations and can be inappropriate or even dangerous for people with high-altitude genetic adaptations. The irony is profound. The same genetic modifications that made the Inca Empire possible now create medical challenges for their descendants in the modern world. The evolutionary success story of high-altitude adaptation has become, in many ways, a cautionary tale about the costs of specialization. Yet despite these challenges, research into high-altitude adaptations continues to provide crucial insights for modern medicine. The genetic mechanisms that create problems for high-altitude populations in modern settings are the same mechanisms that offer solutions for treating altitude-related disorders, cardiovascular disease, and respiratory problems in general populations. Today, scientists around the world are working to unlock these ancient secrets for modern benefit. As we reach the end of this incredible journey through the mountains of Peru and the genetics laboratories of the modern world, let's take a moment to absorb what we've discovered. The Incas didn't just survive at high altitude through willpower or determination alone. They underwent one of the most rapid and comprehensive evolutionary adaptations in human history. In just 11,000 years, a time frame that represents barely a whisper in evolutionary terms, natural selection transformed a population of early American settlers into a subspecies of human specifically designed for life in the thin air of the world's most challenging environments. Their blood carried more oxygen. Their hearts pumped more efficiently. Their lungs extracted every molecule of available air. Their genetic code had been rewritten by the brutal mathematics of survival at altitude. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story isn't the genetic adaptations themselves. It's the sophisticated medical and cultural knowledge they developed to complement their biological advantages. The Incas understood their environment and their bodies with a precision that modern medicine is only beginning to appreciate. They had developed breathing techniques, medicinal protocols, and acclimatization strategies that maximized their genetic gifts. The result was an empire that turned the most hostile environments on Earth into sources of strength. While other civilizations built their power bases in fertile valleys and coastal plains, the Incas claimed the peaks. They made the impossible possible, creating a civilization that thrived where others could barely survive. Today, as we face our own environmental challenges and push the boundaries of human exploration, the Inca legacy provides both inspiration and practical guidance. Their genetic adaptations are informing treatments for heart disease, respiratory disorders, and blood conditions. Their traditional medical knowledge is being validated by modern research and incorporated into contemporary altitude medicine. But perhaps most importantly, their story reminds us that human adaptability extends far beyond what we think possible. In just a few thousand years, the ancestors of the Incas transformed themselves from lowland settlers into high-altitude specialists. They proved that when survival demands it, human evolution can move at lightning speed. As we continue to explore space, dive to ocean depths, and push into environments that challenge human physiology, the Inca example suggests that we may be more adaptable than we imagine. The same evolutionary mechanisms that created the altitude specialists of the Andes continue to operate today, potentially preparing us for challenges we haven't even encountered yet. The next time you find yourself gasping for breath at high altitude, remember that you're experiencing the same challenge that shaped one of history's most remarkable civilizations. The thin air that leaves you dizzy and exhausted was the forge that created superhuman adaptations, the crucible that turned ordinary people into genetic marvels. The Incas conquered more than just mountains. They conquered the very limits of human possibility, and in doing so they left us a legacy that continues to unlock secrets about what it truly means to be human. What other seemingly impossible challenges might hide the seeds of our next evolutionary leap? That's a question worth pondering as we continue to push against the boundaries of human endurance and explore the incredible adaptability that lies dormant in our genetic code.